In early 1942, over 90,000 German troops were trapped near Demyansk, the first major encirclement of the war. The Luftwaffe's success in supplying them by air convinced Hitler that encircled armies could survive indefinitely, a belief that led directly to Stalingrad's catastrophe. This film revisits the original air bridge and the soldiers who paid for its illusion. The Russian winter of 1941 to 1942 was the coldest in a generation. Temperatures plunged below -40, freezing the oil in engines and the breath inside lungs. The German army, the same that had marched triumphantly through Europe, now found itself bogged down before Moscow, shivering in thin uniforms and dying by the thousands. The advance that was supposed to crush the Soviet Union before Christmas had failed. But further north, around the forests and swamps of Lake Ilmen, another disaster was forming, one that could have rivaled Stalingrad a year earlier. There, an entire German army corps found itself encircled deep behind Soviet lines, cut off from supply and surrounded by snow, ice, and enemies on every side. It should have been annihilation. Instead, it became a story Hitler would twist into one of his greatest propaganda triumphs: the Demyansk Pocket. To understand how it happened, we must return to the winter of 1941. The Wehrmacht's Operation Barbarossa had been a campaign of astonishing speed. 500,000 square kilometers were captured in just months. Entire Soviet armies were destroyed. But by December, the German spearheads had outrun their supply lines. Hitler's dream of taking Moscow collapsed in the snows of December 1941, when the Red Army, led by Marshal Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive. The German lines, stretched thin and brittle, began to break. Across the entire front, Soviet armies surged forward, striking at every weak point. In the north, this offensive struck the sector held by the German 16th Army, commanded by General Ernst Busch. His forces were strung out across the frozen forests south of Lake Ilmen, a maze of rivers, lakes, and swamps turned to ice. Their right flank was anchored near Staraya Russa, their left near the village of Demyansk, an old market town surrounded by dense woods and peat bogs. The Red Army saw an opportunity. In January 1942, the Northwestern Front, under General Pavel Kurykin, hurled multiple armies, the 11th, 1st Shock, and 34th, into the German lines north and south of Demyansk. Their objective was simple: cut the road between Staraya Russa and Demyansk, encircle the German corps inside, and destroy it. By early February, the trap had closed. 2 German corps, the 2 Army Corps under General Walter Graf von Brockdorff, Ahlefeldt, and parts of the X-Corps were surrounded. In total, more than 95,000 German soldiers, along with 10,000 auxiliaries and several thousand wounded, were cut off in an area roughly 100 kilometers across. The encircled troops were an eclectic mix: the 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd, and 290th Infantry Divisions, the infamous SS Totenkopf Division, and various supply and Luftwaffe ground units. They were veterans, hardened by the previous year's victories, but they were now isolated in one of the harshest winters on record, deep in enemy territory, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Celsius at night. The Soviets expected them to surrender quickly. Soviet radio broadcasts taunted the trapped soldiers. "You are surrounded. There is no escape. Lay down your arms." But Hitler issued the opposite order. From his headquarters in East Prussia came the command: "Hold Demyansk. There will be no retreat." The Führer does not abandon his soldiers. For the men inside, it was both an inspiration and a death sentence. Supplies were already critical. Ammunition was running low. Bread rations shrank to a few ounces per day. The wounded, lacking proper shelter and medical care, froze to death in their blankets. Yet the Germans refused to yield. To keep them alive, the Luftwaffe proposed an audacious plan: to resupply the entire pocket by air. General Kurt Student, the pioneer of Germany's airborne forces, and General Wolfram von Richthofen of the 8th Air Corps drew up the operation. They calculated that if 200 transport aircraft could fly daily sorties into the improvised airstrips near Demyansk, they could deliver the minimum 270 tons of supplies per day needed to sustain the encircled troops. It had never been done before, not on this scale, not in this weather. The first flights began in February. Heinkel He-111 bombers and Junkers Ju-52 transports, stripped of everything but fuel tanks and cargo space, flew through blizzards to drop ammunition, bread, and medical kits onto frozen lakes or the small airstrip at Pesky. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, but the Luftwaffe persisted. In the early weeks, the airlift was a miracle. Every day, dozens of aircraft appeared over the snow fields, landing on rough ice runways while Soviet artillery shells burst nearby. Mechanics worked bare, handed in minus temperatures to repair engines. Crews froze to the cockpit walls. Planes took off again, loaded with wounded soldiers, shivering, blood-stained men who wept silently as they left their comrades behind. The airlift saved the pocket from immediate collapse, but it could not stop the suffering. Inside, the Germans built a defensive perimeter they called the Kessel, the cauldron. Villages were fortified into strong points. Demyansk, Belyaev, Dubovitsy, Lyubno, and Zalakai became islands of resistance amid the snow. Life inside the Kessel was brutal. The men built dugouts from logs and packed the walls with ice for insulation. The smoke of their stoves betrayed them to Soviet spotters, who shelled them relentlessly. Frostbite mutilated hands and feet. The corpses of horses were boiled for soup. When shells ran out, artillerymen fired single rounds by hand. The wounded were buried under snow because the ground was too hard to dig. For the Soviets, the siege was equally punishing. The Red Army attacked in waves across the forests, often without adequate artillery or winter clothing. Soviet casualties mounted by the thousands. Frozen corpses lay where they fell, marking the invisible front line. In late February, German High Command organized a relief attempt. The Gruppe Seydlitz, an ad hoc combat group from the 8th Army Corps under General Walther von Seydlitz, Kurzbach, was ordered to break through from the west across the frozen Lovat River. The operation, codenamed Brückenschlag or Bridge Building, began in March. The relief force attacked through deep snow and dense forest, supported by tanks and Stukas. Progress was agonizingly slow. The Soviets resisted fiercely, counterattacking from fortified villages. Every advance cost hundreds of lives, but the German soldiers outside the pocket knew that their comrades were starving inside, and they pressed on with grim determination. Meanwhile, inside the encirclement, Brockdorf, Ahlefeldt organized counterattacks to hold the corridor open. The SS Totenkopf Division, despite suffering massive losses, launched a series of assaults to keep Soviet forces from splitting the pocket. Its commander, SS Gruppenführer Theodor Eicke, one of the most feared men in the Waffen-SS, personally led attacks from the front. By mid-March, the relief spearheads were within striking distance of the pocket. Then the weather turned again. Snowstorms grounded the Luftwaffe, and supplies dwindled. For days, the two German groups fought toward each other, separated by just a few kilometers of swamp and forest. On April 21st, after more than 2 months of encirclement, the corridor finally opened. The troops of the two Army Corps met the advancing relief force near Rameshevo, linking the pocket to the outside world. The men who emerged were ghosts, emaciated, frostbitten, and hollow-eyed. They had survived 72 days under siege. The Demyansk airlift had delivered 65,000 tons of supplies, a logistical feat unprecedented in warfare. It had cost the Luftwaffe dearly. More than 250 aircraft were destroyed, 387 airmen were killed, and hundreds more were wounded. But it worked. The encircled corps had not been annihilated. Hitler seized upon the event as a vindication of his leadership. He hailed it as proof that an army could hold out indefinitely if supplied by air and ordered never to surrender. The Führer's faith has triumphed, proclaimed the newspapers. The men of the Demyansk Pocket were celebrated as heroes of endurance. But the reality was darker. The airlift had been a desperate improvisation that barely succeeded under favorable conditions. A short distance to the pocket, the availability of frozen landing zones, and relatively weak Soviet air opposition. It provided Hitler with precisely the wrong lesson. When the 6th Army was encircled at Stalingrad later that same year, he would invoke Demyansk as proof that supply by air could sustain an entire army, a fatal delusion that condemned 300,000 men. In the months following the breakout, fighting around Demyansk continued. The corridor was narrow, only 6 kilometers wide, and Soviet forces attacked it constantly. The area became known as the Rameshevo Corridor, a deadly funnel of artillery fire. For the soldiers, the monotony of death became routine. "We were buried alive," wrote one German survivor. "The snow fell, the shells came, and the dead were dragged away. That was all." The front around Demyansk stagnated until early 1943, when the German line finally withdrew as part of the general retreat after Stalingrad. In total, the Demyansk battle had cost the Germans more than 17,000 dead and missing, and another 36,000 wounded or frostbitten. Soviet losses were even greater, over 100,000 casualties. But in Nazi Germany, the story was told differently. Goebbels' propaganda machine transformed Demyansk into a legend of heroism. For the men who had actually been there, the truth was far more grim. They remembered endless snow, frozen meat rations, and comrades dying quietly in their dugouts. Veterans would later say that survival depended less on courage than on numbness, the ability to shut down emotion and simply endure. In the end, Demyansk changed little on the map, but much in perception. For the Wehrmacht, it became a symbol of perseverance. For Hitler, it became a dangerous myth. The illusion that air supply could sustain encircled forces would later doom the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The real legacy of Demyansk was human, a preview of the attrition warfare that would grind both armies down over the next 3 years. It showed the Red Army learning from its mistakes and the German Army beginning its slow transition from blitzkrieg to survival. Today, the forests around Demyansk are quiet. The swamps have reclaimed the trenches. Every spring when the snow melts, locals still find relics: helmets, medals, rusted bayonets, and sometimes the bones of those who never left. For historians, the Demyansk Pocket is often remembered as a logistical triumph. For the men who lived it, it was a frozen nightmare, a place where faith replaced strategy and endurance replaced hope. Hitler called it proof of divine destiny. The soldiers called it what it was: hell under snow.